Thank you, Mr. Lukowski. Members will be recognized by order of seniority for 5 minutes of questioning. An additional round of questioning may be called after all members have been recognized. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. I want to begin. I wonder if Mr. Ivey, if you would pull back up, your staff might pull back up the enlargement you had, the first one, the statement by a DHS official from November 2023.
Mr. Novak?
I think that's right. Or if you, if you have the enlargement. And let me say, as I'm beginning, or asking that to come up, thank you, I'll use it in just a sec if you hold it for me. First of all, it's interesting how little separates the views expressed on the panel, and I think between me and the ranking member of the subcommittee. And I think therein lies something that's very, that needs to be focused on. There are some red herrings or straw men here that can be knocked down pretty quickly. I agree this is not about partisanship, by the way. I mean, I think there's some evidence that the conservatives were more frequently censored, but that is not at all the point. The problem is that it can affect and will affect both sides at the same time. Here's what troubles me, though. Okay. This is a November 2023 statement by Brandon Wales. He says, CISA does not and has never censored speech or facilitated censorship. Any such claims are patently false. So it would be one thing if this turned out to be an excess or a misjudgment or something that grew up naturally out of the COVID pandemic or something, or the election concern that people say, look, we went too far, we've curtailed that, we no longer do that. But that's not what's being said here. It is a categorical declaration that there has been no censorship. And I got to tell you, that deepens the concern. Because we are, if the situation were, okay, the Disinformation Governance Board has been abandoned because there was a huge public outcry, we'd realize at CISA or DHS that was a mistake. That's one thing. But for them to abandon it and for the effort to go subterranean, underground, and be popping up but continue to be pursued, that's a very significant thing, and it certainly justifies the continued examination into this topic. And I would say with my friend from Maryland, the ranking member, this contention that the social media platforms were never compelled, that is the thing that continues to be said. But, and the ranking members read the cases, so have I, from the Fifth Circuit, that make clear the tests that are applied is not that you're lined up against the wall with a gun at your head to say you must take this information down off your social media platform. The question is the degree to which government may be perceived to have been intensively involved, and thereby the censorship by the so-called private entity becomes government action. It's a little bit like the notion, the old saying, you remember, nice little business you got there, it'd be a shame if something were to happen to it. That is a threat, even though it isn't stated in threatening language. Mr. Schellenberger, how about that? We've got CISA taking down the video on that had the fictional character Sharon urged to report as misinformation what her uncle was stating online. They've taken that down. They've done a number of things like that to telegraph that this isn't something we're going to do anymore. I took that to be the thrust of Jen Easterly's testimony in the Appropriations Committee, and yet this is a declaration we've never done it. And there's not even an issue about whether we've done it or something that needs to get ironed out. What about that? Shouldn't we be concerned about that phenomenon?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. If it were up to me, I think if there's important cybersecurity activities happening in CISA that should continue, I think they need to be under a different agency, because this agency actively not just participated but led this creation of a censorship apparatus. It wasn't, and now that them saying, oh, we were just doing research, it was a mass flagging and censorship operation that was coordinated with a broader effort to pressure the platforms to do more censorship. That was going on since 2016. So yeah, I think it's disingenuous to suggest that that they were just doing research.
Mr. Chenoweth, as the litigation, like Missouri versus Biden, you mentioned the Murthy case, I guess it's Murthy in the Supreme Court, I guess is the name of it there. Courts have differed sometimes with themselves on what level of government actions constitute interference with freedom of speech. Why is that a challenge? And how should courts resolve it?
I think there's a concern that there may be a category mistake here, Mr. Chairman, because a lot of the precedents, because the government hasn't done this kind of censorship by and large going back 10, 20, 40, 50 years. And so the precedents that exist at the Supreme Court are largely precedents where there have been private entities that have been doing censorship and have been sued. And then, and this is Bantam Books as an example of this. And then the question is, well, was that private conduct turned into state action? And so if you're suing a private entity and you're trying to, because if it is a private entity, it's truly private action, then the First Amendment doesn't apply. So if you're suing a private entity and saying that they engaged in state action, then there's precedents that suggest, how do you know that there's state action there? And the tests have been things like coercion and so forth, also entanglement, also the way that you described it, Mr. Chairman, is just how involved are we here? But the reason for that is because we want to be very careful about saying that a private entity has become a public entity. We need to be very careful about that. We need to draw that line carefully, because if that private entity is treated as a public entity, then its liberties have really been constricted, particularly by the First Amendment then applying to it. Yeah. But that's not what we're talking about here. In Murphy v. Missouri, we didn't sue any private entities. We're suing the government. And the question is, what's the standard that affects the government when the government is engaged in government-led censorship? And the standard there shouldn't be coercion. It shouldn't be the standard that applies when you're suing a private entity. It needs to be the First Amendment standard. And the text of the First Amendment says abridge, and that means diminish. And you're telling me that nothing that CISA did diminished free speech, that it didn't diminish speech? Of course it did. The whole point of it was to diminish speech.
Undoubtedly it did. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time has long since expired.